Alberta Premier Daniel Smith says the province will introduce a motion under the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Now, this time it's in relation to the proposed emissions cap on the oil and gas sector, which Smith says could create major economic damage and lead to thousands of job losses. Tyler Dawson is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. He joins us now from Edmonton to talk about this in a little more detail. Now, Tyler, it appears as though Alberta government officials are taking a very strong line in protecting our oil sands.
It seems like it. I mean, one of the things with the Sovereignty Act when it was first introduced, when it was invoked last year around this time on the clean electricity regulations, was really the question of what it would do, what it could do. Of course, Alberta cannot opt out of federal laws, for example. So the realities of the Sovereignty Act's applicability has sort of been, I think, narrowed a little bit from when it was first proposed. But what we saw on Tuesday was probably one of the more robust responses that could have been imagined under the Sovereignty Act. And it was quite interesting because one of them refers to the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, which people may remember from back in, I think it was 2020 or 2021, when there were a lot of rail blockade protests. It was also used during the COVID era to disperse protests around hospitals, things like that. So oil and gas facilities are going to get protection under that. There will also be a restriction on any federal officials entering any oil and gas facility without prior provincial approval. And the last part is, well, there are other components, but the other major part is the government's going to declare that all emissions data coming from oil sands facilities basically is proprietary provincial data and can only be released at their discretion. So it's a little bit unclear, I think, what all of this might look like in practice. But of course, there's the possibility that the emissions cap never comes in anyways. It's obviously going to take some time to develop what the sort of ceiling for emissions is going to look like. I believe they're collecting data over the next year or two before potentially introducing the actual cap. There's a very good chance there will be a different federal government by then, and it's hard to imagine that a Prime Minister, Pierre Poilievre, is going to pursue policies that are the same towards the oil and gas sector that the Liberals are in Ottawa. So bit of there's things up in the air, certainly. So we may never see any of this stuff come into effect, but certainly they've got their ducks in a row a little bit and are bearing their fangs, so to speak, on this particular front.
The UCP has called for the Lethbridge West by-election, Tyler. Voters will be going to the polls a week before Christmas on December the 18th. Now, the two front-runners so far, UCP's John Middleton Hope and the NDP's Rob Miyashiro. Tyler, December 18th, kind of an odd time to be voting, but Premier Daniel Smith didn't really have much choice, did she?
No, I mean, so this is to replace Shannon Phillips, of course, the NDP MLA who stepped down, and I believe she stepped down on Canada Day. And so there's basically was sort of 6 months timeline to get this thing done. So a week before Christmas it is. I'm very curious to see what voter turnout is going to be. People will surely have other things on their minds. But, on the flip side, maybe people will be like, well, we've been waiting 6 months for a representative. Maybe I better get out and vote. So that part of it is going to be interesting. I mean, turnout is not usually humongous for by-elections anyways. And part of the reason it was delayed is because Naheed Nenshi, the NDP leader, doesn't have a seat in the legislature yet. And Smith had said, look, I'd rather run two by-elections at the same time to sort of save on costs instead of running two separate ones at different times. He's not shown any particular inclination. He doesn't seem to be in a hurry, at any rate, to get into the legislature. So that's sort of, I think, why it ended up waiting as long as it did. Now, the other thing, of course, which I think we've talked about before, is that this is really going to be the first electoral test of Nenshi's NDP. He became leader back in the late spring, early summer. There hasn't been a by-election since then. There hasn't been any real test of his party. So it'll be quite interesting to see how they perform, if they can hold on to this NDP seat that it has been since, I think, 2015. And of course, this will be a little bit of a referendum in some way on the performance of Danielle Smith's government, whether or not people like the track that her folks are on right now. So an odd time, possibly not massive voter turnout, but I think we'll be able to draw a few conclusions from this regardless of what ends up happening.
Why wouldn't the Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi push harder to try and get a seat so he can debate Smith at the legislature? You're the party leader. You should be there. Doesn't that make sense?
Yeah, it is weird because he also loses access to a bunch of stuff. I mean, he's not around to talk to reporters to the same
Right.
extent that he would be if he was in the House. They're not able to get social media clips of him in the legislature. It lowers his profile a little bit, and it does seem like he's kept a relatively low profile over the past 6 months, which it seems to be an odd set of choices for the people around him right now. There was a train of thought that when Jagmeet Singh, the federal NDP leader, first became NDP leader, and he didn't have a seat in parliament, and there was this idea that, well, maybe he can float above the fray of sort of question period and the mudslinging and stuff like that for a little while. So that's maybe the philosophy that the Nenshi NDP are operating under right now. But it does strike me as odd, and even some of the UCP people I've talked to, I mean, they obviously want him in the House for the same reasons. They want to be able to feud with him in question period and things like that. But they're sort of like, well, where is he? He should be more of a threat than he seems to be right now. So it is sort of an odd situation.
Some big news in our provincial capital, Tyler, and that half of the jail at the Edmonton Youth Offender Centre will be converted into an addictions treatment facility for youth. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so this is a $23 million renovation project, and it's going to take about half of that facility to renovate it to create, I think, 105 addiction spaces for minors. Now, while it's going to be at that site, it is not going to be part of the jail. There will be no shared living spaces. There will be no overlap between the sort of incarcerated youth and the youth who are there for addictions treatment. That 105 number is pretty significant. There are currently about 70 youth addictions beds in the province. So adding 105, bringing the total up to 175 is, a really, really significant increase in the number of treatment spaces available. And this is part, obviously, of this whole major sort of investment that the UCP has been doing in mental health and addictions for the past 5 or 6 years, 5 years, I guess. And it's part of the Alberta model of treating drug addiction, which is essentially trying to get people into treatment and into recovery, focusing less on harm reduction, more on detox and sobriety and things like that. So it's a little unclear, I think, to what extent there is an addictions crisis among youth in Alberta, among minors in Alberta. I spoke to the minister this week, and Dan Williams, the mental health and addictions minister, and he said it's certainly getting worse, and that a lot of the sort of community and social supports that existed before the COVID-19 pandemic have gone away, and that sort of, led to an expansion of this crisis across sort of all demographics. But there's going to be a lot more access at any rate, and people will be able to voluntarily enter that facility. There could also be the situation where youth are mandated into treatment. Now, of course, we've been talking about this down the road, probably next spring for adults. The rules that allow for a youth to be put into mandatory treatment actually have existed since 2006. So it'll be sort of a two-prong stream of people, I guess, who could end up in this facility getting treatment.
With Liberal MP Randy Boissonnault out of Justin Trudeau's cabinet, that means Alberta no longer has specific representation in cabinet. So Tyler, what kind of an impact will this really have on our province in the short term? I mean, many people argue in the long term it's no big deal since Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives will be elected next year anyway.
Well, and then, the other way to dismiss it, I suppose, would be to say, well, are the Liberals listening to anyone from Alberta anyways? So, does it really matter? It does matter, I think, in the case of Jasper. Randy Boissonnault was the lead on the Jasper sort of rebuild. So on that front, I think it could matter a little bit. I mean, that's not to say that the Liberals are not committed to the Jasper rebuild and things like that. But it probably didn't hurt to have an Alberta voice at that table for some of those discussions. Certainly, it'll make it'll make announcements a little more challenging in Alberta. It'll make some of the sort of information coming back to Ottawa from Alberta a little bit more challenging. But there isn't really another option for them to fill that seat. There's only one other Liberal MP in in Alberta, and that's George Chahal down in Calgary. And there's no Liberals at all from Saskatchewan. So it's slim pickings if they wanted to restaff cabinet with some prairie representation there. So I don't know if it's going to be a massive impact. I doubt it will be, actually, but it does probably matter a little bit on some of these issues.
Tyler, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper is now the board chair of AIMCO, the Investment Crown Corporation, which runs the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund and manages public pension plans. Now, even though he's been out of government for close to 10 years now and does not have experience managing pension plans, Premier Daniel Smith feels, you know what, he's the right person for the job here.
Yeah, they'd apparently been trying to get him on board for quite some time, and there were a few logistical difficulties that needed to get sorted out. But he's in now, and you're right, he doesn't have any particular pension fund management experience, although he has been on the board of investment funds and venture capital firms and things like that over the past decade. So there is some, money management insight there, I suppose. And the government basically said, well, look, he was great with tax dollars when he was the prime minister, so he'll be a responsible steward of AIMCO. And the issue with AIMCO has basically been twofold. The first is that the returns were not as good as the government had wanted on the investments that AIMCO was making, and that the costs for managing those funds were sort of going up. So Harper and the other people who've been appointed to the board will sort of be mandated with turning that around a little bit. It's going to be interesting to see how that turns out. There is now also going to be sort of permanent political representation on the AIMCO board in the part of, I think, the Deputy Minister of Finance. So AIMCO's been independent basically since it was created in 2006, I think. And there's arguably now a little bit of a deterioration in its independence from government. And I think it's interesting because AIMCO is one of those things that people paid attention to when things went wrong. There was some investment stuff during the pandemic that was a bit of a disaster. And the UCP has, for better or worse, I think, guaranteed that journalists and business reporters in particular are going to be keeping a close eye on what AIMCO is up to over the next few years. And it could be good news or it could be bad news. But either way, I think people are going to be watching to see how this plays out.
The Alberta government is considering making some changes to our driver's licenses. Now, at the UCP convention earlier this month, ministers talked about adding citizenship to licenses in order to make it easier to determine citizenship at the polling stations. Now, Tyler, even though this has been done before by other provinces, it's really not done anymore, is it?
No, I think BC and Ontario had done it before, and it's maybe one province still has it, but it's going away. So Alberta's going against the trend here a little bit, but I'm not sure why other provinces have dropped it. Although you can imagine a little bit of sort of paperwork inconvenience if people are acquiring citizenship in the middle of their driver's license period, and then they have to get a new one and pay the $100 or whatever. And so you can imagine it'd be a little bit annoying for some folks. But yeah, the citizenship thing was primarily a sort of a voter security measure is how they're sort of framing it. The other thing that could happen is we might get our health number on our driver's license. So it'd be a one card fits all kind of system. Of course, people have been talking about getting rid of the paper health cards in Alberta for ages and ages and ages. And I'm sure you do as well, have one sort of deteriorating in your wallet that you have to very carefully pull out every time you're at the doctor to make sure you don't shear it in half.
Actually, I had mine laminated, so it's
Oh well,
protected a little bit.
that's the way to do it. Mine is looking like an old Kleenex at this point. But there is apparently talk afoot to get those numbers on your driver's license. So you'll have one plastic card. It'll have everything you need. No decisions have been made on that front yet, but some possible changes down the road to the driver's license.
Tyler, the Alberta government is also moving forward with a no-fault insurance system, but unlike British Columbia and Saskatchewan, it will not be publicly funded. Officials say in the long run, this will actually help bring down the cost of insurance here in Alberta.
That's what they're saying. And in the short term, it's going to do the opposite. So the way it's going to work basically is for the next couple of years, the cap on insurance increases is going to go up. So insurance companies will be able to raise their rates by a little bit more next year and the year after. At that point, the no-fault insurance system is going to come in, and that basically means that if you are hit by another driver, you cannot sue the driver. There will be an amount of money that is set out that will be yours. You will get it. So it basically reduces litigation essentially, and it reduces the amount of money that an insurance company might have to pay out as the result of a court challenge. So that should, in theory, bring insurance cost to the insurance companies down. And in theory, they will then pass those savings on to Albertans in the form of lower premiums. This is pretty controversial in the insurance world, and certainly the accident injury lawyer world, who stand to lose out on a lot of their work because of this sort of thing. But in the long run, it ought to bring prices down. But again, we'll have to see if that actually plays out.
And like you said, if they pass the savings on to the consumers, that's what's key, right?
Exactly.
Just pocketing the savings. Tyler, for a couple more weeks, consultation is open on Alberta's assisted suicide regime. Now, the framework is set up by Ottawa, but healthcare is a provincial responsibility, so there might be some room to maneuver here?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting situation, actually. So the way MAID is set up right now is there's basically two ways a person could receive assisted suicide. The first is a grievous and irremediable medical condition, that be something like late stage cancer, for example, and they could access assisted suicide that way. The other track that exists is for people who have disabilities and who are suffering significantly. There's a potential planned expansion of that to people for whom mental illness is their only sort of condition. That's been really, really controversial. In fact, the federal government has pushed back doing anything on that until I think 2027. Very strongly opposed by conservative parties across the country, by religious groups, for example. It's super controversial and super complicated as well. So the Alberta government has launched this consultation. To essentially look at what Alberta could, in theory, do around its assisted suicide regime. So there was a case in Calgary earlier this year, for example, about a father who was trying to prevent his 27-year-old daughter from receiving assisted suicide. And it didn't go great in the courts for the father. He ended up dropping his court case for a couple of reasons. But all of it just to say this consultation is going to look at a few things. The first is whether or not there should be some sort of oversight board that looks at MAID approvals in the province. The second one is whether or not there should be some sort of dispute mechanism for families. So say your loved one gets approved for assisted suicide, you could perhaps challenge that in some fashion outside the courts. The third would be some way to release confidential medical information in those cases. One of the issues in the Calgary case I mentioned is that the judge did not force the young woman to ever actually say what her medical conditions were, citing sort of confidentiality. And the last one is perhaps restricting some of the criteria in Alberta in a way that would differ from the federal rules. So really, really complicated situation. There's all sorts of medical ethics questions, questions of autonomy, and all those questions about policy changes exist, I think, even if MAID is not expanded to those with mental illness as their only condition. You can imagine a scenario in which someone has a disability and their family opposes it, for example. So really, really touchy, complicated territory. But that consultation's ongoing, and we could see legislative or regulatory changes at some point down the road. And I'll certainly be keeping an eye on that because it could put Alberta offside, for better or worse, from other provinces, which would be a very interesting scenario.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks again for joining us today from Edmonton.
My pleasure, Hal.